My name is Vivian Cross. I'm 34 years old, and I've held a human heart still in my hands, while a room full of people waited to see if it would beat again. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of learning not to flinch, no matter what's put in front of you. But nothing in a trauma bay ever prepared me for the day my ex-mother-in-law found me by the NICU windows and smiled like she'd been waiting years for the chance. It was a Thursday evening, almost a year to the day since my divorce was finalized. I'd just finished a 14-hour shift, the kind where you lose count of how many times you've said the words, "We're going to take good care of you," to a stranger who might not make it. I was cutting through the maternity wing on my way to the elevators, the same shortcut I'd taken 100 times without thinking twice about it. That's when I saw her standing near the glass, hands folded in front of her like she was posing for a portrait. Diane Whitmore has a particular way of holding herself, chin lifted just enough to remind you she thinks she's looking down at you, even when she isn't. She'd been visiting, of course. Word had already reached me weeks earlier that Renee had delivered, but I hadn't let myself think about it too much. I'd trained myself not to. Diane saw me before I could turn around and pretend I hadn't seen her first. She stepped directly into my path, the way she used to step into arguments at family dinners, certain that her presence alone was enough to win. She looked me over slowly, my scrubs, the dark circles under my eyes that 14 hours of surgery leaves behind, and her mouth curved into that smile, the one that looks warm from a distance and cold up close. Then she said it, loud enough that 2 nurses behind the station glanced up from their charts. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a healthy baby boy with a woman who actually wanted to give him one." I want you to understand what those words were built out of. 6 years of being called cold. 6 years of being the reason whispered about at garden club luncheons and country club dinners. The reason a marriage never gave anyone grandchildren. The reason a good man had to go find happiness somewhere else. All of it compressed into a single sentence, delivered with a smile, in a hallway where I couldn't even raise my voice without every nurse on that floor hearing it. I didn't flinch. I want to be honest with you. There was a version of me from years earlier who might have. But that version of me had been slowly worn down into someone else. Someone who had learned to hold still under far worse things than a cruel woman's satisfaction. I looked at Diane the way I look at a monitor when I need to read it correctly instead of react to it. Calm, level, waiting for the real information underneath the noise. "Is that what you believe?" I asked her. "Just that, nothing more." She blinked. I watched the confusion pass over her face, quick and small, because she had expected tears, or anger, or at least the flicker of hurt she'd spent years learning to enjoy. She got none of it. I stood there in my wrinkled scrubs with my badge still clipped crooked from the last coat I'd run, and I let the silence stretch a little longer than was comfortable for her. That was the only weapon I had in that moment, and I used it. What Diane didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that 5 minutes earlier I had signed a set of papers in my car in the parking garage before I'd even walked through the hospital doors. Papers that had been sitting in my bag for 2 days while I decided whether I had the nerve to file them. What she also didn't know was that somewhere behind her, coming down that same corridor, was a man neither she nor Renee Castillo had ever expected to see again. A man whose name was about to be spoken out loud in a courtroom in a way that would unravel every single word Diane Whitmore had just used to try to humiliate me. I didn't know it yet either. Not fully. I only knew that I had finally stopped being quiet about the parts of my life that were never mine to be ashamed of. And somewhere down that hallway, the automatic doors gave their soft mechanical hiss, the sound they make every single day for 1,000 different reasons. This time, I would learn later, they opened for a reason that would change everything Diane Whitmore thought she understood about her son, about her perfect grandson, and about the daughter-in-law she had spent 6 years quietly destroying in front of an entire town. I want to tell you how I got to that hallway before I tell you what happened after it, because the woman standing there, calm as still water, asking one simple question instead of breaking down, wasn't born that way. She was built, slowly, out of every single thing this family took from her, and every single thing she decided. One Thursday evening, she was finally done giving away for free. If you've ever had someone smile while they tried to humiliate you in public, and you found a way to stay standing anyway, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one speak to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because what happened 5 minutes after that smile is the part of this story I've been waiting to tell you. Before I tell you what happened after that hallway, you need to understand who I was long before I ever met Diane Whitmore, or her son. I grew up in a small coastal town in North Carolina, the kind of place where the tide charts mattered more than the news, and everybody knew whose boat belonged to whom. My mother worked at a dry cleaner's for 22 years. My father repaired outboard motors out of a shed behind our house, and some winters that shed was the only thing keeping the lights on. We weren't poor exactly, but we were the kind of family where a broken refrigerator was a crisis, not an inconvenience. I learned early that nothing in this life gets handed to you gently. You either work for it with your head down, or you go without. I was the first person in my family to go to college, let alone medical school. I paid my way through with scholarships, night shifts at a diner, and enough student loans to make my chest tighten every time I opened the mail. I remember studying anatomy textbooks at 2 in the morning, with grease still under my fingernails from the diner fryer, telling myself that if I just kept my head down and did the work, eventually somebody would notice. Eventually the truth of who I was would speak for itself. That belief became something close to a religion for me. Work quietly. Prove yourself through results. Let your hands do the talking instead of your mouth. That philosophy served me well in the one place it was actually meant for, the operating room. I became a trauma surgeon because I liked the clarity of it. A person comes in broken, and either you fix what's in front of you, or you don't. There's no room for excuses, no room for spin, no room for someone else's version of events overriding what the monitors are telling you. I built a reputation over 10 years for being the surgeon other doctors wanted in the room during the worst moments, the one whose hands didn't shake even when everything around her was falling apart. Nurses used to say that if Dr. Cross walked into a code, you could feel the room settle, as the air itself had exhaled. But the same steadiness that made me good at my job became a kind of prison everywhere else in my life. I never learned how to defend myself outside of a sterile room with clear protocols and clean answers. I never learned how to fight a lie that didn't show up on an X-ray. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about growing up believing that quiet competence is enough. It works right up until you meet people who don't care about the truth at all. People who have their own story they need you to play a part in, whether you agree to it or not. I met Colton Whitmore when I was 26, still finishing my residency, exhausted in the particular way only med school can exhaust a person. He walked into my life like sunlight through a window I didn't know was dirty, charming in that effortless way some men are, remembering small details about people he'd only just met, laughing easily, making a room feel warmer just by being in it. His family had money, old coastal money, the kind tied up in marinas and country club memberships, and a name that got you a good table at any restaurant in 3 counties. I told myself it didn't matter to me, and mostly it didn't. I wasn't chasing comfort. I was chasing something that felt, for the first time in my exhausting, disciplined life, like ease. His mother, Diane, ran their side of the world the way a general runs a campaign. She's already decided she's going to win. She chaired the garden club. She sat on the board of the yacht club auxiliary. She organized the holiday gala every single year and made certain everyone remembered who had organized it. Diane had buried her husband young, and in the years after, she poured every ounce of herself into making sure Colton turned out to be proof that she hadn't failed at anything. He was her masterpiece. Which meant, though I didn't understand this yet, that in Diane's world, Colton could never be the flawed one. If something was wrong, it had to be wrong somewhere else. I want to be honest with you about something, Because I think it matters. I wasn't naive when I married Colton. I saw the way his mother looked at me sometimes, that quick assessing glance that measured whether I was polished enough for their circle. I saw the way she corrected the way I held my fork at family dinners. Gently, always gently. The way a queen corrects a servant she's decided to be gracious toward. I told myself none of that mattered, because I wasn't marrying his mother. I was marrying him, and he loved me, and I loved the life we were building, where I finally got to stop proving myself every single day and just exist. That belief, that quiet competence and quiet endurance would always be enough to protect me, followed me straight into that marriage, the way an old habit follows you into a new house. I didn't know yet that the same silence that made me a good surgeon would one day let an entire town believe a lie about my own body without me ever once standing up to correct it out loud. I didn't know that the woman who could hold a bleeding artery closed with steady hands for 4 hours straight would spend 6 years letting other people write the story of who she was, simply because she believed, the way she'd always believed, that the truth would eventually speak for itself. It wouldn't, not on its own, not without me finally learning the hardest lesson of my life, that some silences don't protect you. They just give other people more time to build a lie tall enough to bury you under it. Colton and I got married when I was 28, on a bright September afternoon at the country club overlooking the marina. Exactly the kind of wedding Diane had probably been planning in her head since the day he was born. I remember standing at the altar thinking I had finally arrived somewhere safe. I had no idea I was standing at the edge of a story that other people had already started writing for me. One I wouldn't fully read until years later. We wanted children almost immediately. Colton talked about it during our engagement, the way some men talk about buying a boat, with a kind of eager, uncomplicated excitement that I found endearing at the time. We tried for nearly 2 years without anything happening, and slowly that eagerness in our house curdled into something heavier. The not happening became its own presence at our dinner table, sitting between us in the empty chair we never talked about directly, but both of us could feel. I did what any physician would do in that situation. I suggested, gently at first, that we both get tested. Simple blood work, a basic evaluation, nothing invasive or dramatic, just information. I ordered these same tests for patients constantly without a second thought. Colton laughed it off the first time I brought it up, waved his hand like I'd suggested something absurd. The second time I brought it up, the laugh was gone, replaced by something sharper. He told me Whitmore men didn't have those kinds of problems. He said it the way you'd state a fact about the tide coming in, something so obviously true it didn't need proving. I pushed a little further, because I was a doctor, and I knew that kind of certainty without evidence usually meant somebody was afraid of what the evidence might say. He didn't like that. He gave me a short speech about leaving things in God's hands, about how a man doesn't need a piece of paper telling him what he already knows about himself. I remember standing in our kitchen that night, feeling the conversation close like a door I hadn't realized was swinging shut, and I let it close. I told myself I was being patient. I told myself that pushing a grown man toward a clinic against his will wasn't something a good wife did. Looking back now, I understand that what I actually did was give silence 1 more inch of room to grow in. I went and got tested myself anyway, quietly, without telling him. My results came back completely normal. I sat in the parking lot of that clinic reading the paper twice, feeling something strange and hollow settle into my chest. If it wasn't me, then what was it? I didn't have an answer, and because I didn't have an answer, and because Colton refused to even look for one, the silence around our house just kept stretching out further and further until it had room enough for other people to start filling it in for us. Diane filled it in first. I don't think she set out to be cruel. Not at the very beginning. I think she simply couldn't accept that her son might be the reason. So when Colton started quietly suggesting to her that maybe the trouble was me, she picked that story up like it was scripture, and she carried it everywhere she went. It started small, the way these things always do. A sympathetic sigh at a garden club luncheon, a hand resting on someone's arm at the yacht club, while she lowered her voice just enough to make sure it carried further than a whisper ever could. "Poor Colton," she'd say. "He wanted a family so badly." Then it grew teeth. Oh, I remember a holiday gala that first winter, the kind of event Diane spent months orchestrating down to the last centerpiece, where she introduced me to a visiting board member's wife with a look of practiced, performative pity already loaded into her face before she even opened her mouth. "This is Vivian," she said, "my daughter-in-law. She's a surgeon, if you can believe it." Such a shame about the grandchildren, though. The woman gave me a slow, understanding nod, the kind you give someone you've already decided to feel sorry for, and I stood there in my good dress holding a champagne flute I suddenly couldn't taste, realizing that whatever story had been told about me had already made its way around that room long before I'd walked into it. Diane patted my hand that night, like I was the one who needed comforting, and then she said the line she would go on repeating for years, the line I would eventually hear so many times it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding almost like a diagnosis. "Some women just aren't built for it," she said, smiling as she said it, believing every word. That was the part that made it so hard to fight. She wasn't performing cruelty on purpose. She was repeating something her son had handed her, polished and certain, and she genuinely had no idea the words she was carrying around that room like a party favor were a lie wearing her own gentle, well-meaning voice. I never confronted Colton about it that night, or the many nights after it that followed the same pattern. I kept telling myself the truth would sort itself out eventually, that good, quiet work and good, quiet patience would be enough to outlast a rumor. I had believed that formula my whole life, and it had gotten me through medical school and residency and every hard thing before it. I didn't understand yet that some lies aren't waiting to be outlasted. They're waiting for you to stay quiet long enough that they can finish becoming the truth. Renee Castillo had been my best friend since we were 17 years old, sitting next to each other in a biology class neither of us particularly cared about, laughing at the same dry jokes the teacher never intended to be funny. We stayed close through everything that came after: my move away for college, her string of jobs that never quite stuck, the years and the distance that usually pull people apart. She was standing beside me the day my father passed, and she stood up in a soft green dress at my wedding, and cried openly during my vows. So when the whispers about me started making their way through the garden club circuit and the country club dinners, Renee was the one I leaned on. She'd come over with a bottle of wine and let me talk myself in circles for hours, and she always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say, to make the ache in my chest quiet down for a little while. Looking back now, I can see that every single one of her comforts had a hook buried inside it. "You're so accomplished, Vivian," she'd say. "Maybe motherhood just isn't your path. Colton adores you. Don't let his mother get inside your head. You don't need a baby to be whole." Kind words, all of them, spoken with what I believed at the time was genuine tenderness, but every single one of them landed on the same bruise. Every single one of them quietly reminded me of the thing I was supposedly lacking, dressed up gently enough that I never once thought to question who benefited from me believing it. I didn't notice, not then, how often her eyes drifted toward Colton across a crowded room, or the small, specific ways she'd started knowing his schedule without me ever having mentioned it. I was too grateful to have one person in my life who didn't seem to be quietly judging me the way the rest of the town had started to. She would sit curled up on my own couch, in my own house, and tell me I deserved better, and I would nod along, never once imagining that what she actually meant was that she deserved my life. Colton filed for divorce on a Tuesday. I came home from a double shift to find a manila envelope waiting on the kitchen counter, and his closet already half emptied, like he hadn't even wanted to be in the house when I found out. He didn't call me. He didn't sit me down. He simply left, and by that weekend he had already moved into an apartment across town with Renee, and the story about our marriage had already been written and distributed before I'd even had the chance to understand what had happened to me. The version that spread through town was tidy and cruel, in exactly the way these stories always are. Vivian is cold. Vivian is married to her career. Vivian couldn't give him children, and every man deserves a family eventually. Doesn't he? Diane made certain that story reached every corner of that town. Every luncheon, every gala committee meeting, every quiet conversation over coffee. And Renee, my Renee, the woman who had cried at my wedding, said absolutely nothing to correct any of it. The two people who had known me the longest simply let me become a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties, and I let them, because fighting back felt like it would only prove the story true. I didn't post a single word about it anywhere. I didn't call a soul to defend myself. I went back to work the next morning and set a fractured femur and told a frightened teenager he was going to be fine, and he was, and that felt like the only honest thing that happened to me the entire week. If you've ever swallowed a lie about yourself just to keep some fragile version of peace intact, just to protect a reputation you spent years building, then you already understand exactly what that particular silence tastes like. It tastes like something you're not allowed to spit out. The cost of that silence didn't stay contained to my marriage for long. I'd spent nearly a decade quietly building the trauma protocols my hospital still ran on, working every brutal overnight shift nobody else wanted, putting in the hours that made me the obvious choice when the chief of trauma position finally opened up. Everyone in that department knew the job was as good as mine. Then the whispers reached the credentialing committee, and I watched, helpless, as they took root there too. Not the truth, because there was no truth to find, just the shape of the rumor. Dr. Cross has some instability in her personal life. There are questions about her judgment right now. Did you hear about the divorce? About what his family says about her? When the announcement finally came, the position went to a colleague with half my hours and none of my protocols. They told me I'd been a strong candidate. They told me it had been a difficult decision. What they never told me, not directly, was the real reason, but I had grown up in a small town my whole life. I knew exactly what a verdict sounded like when it was dressed up as a compliment. That was the night something in me finally shifted, sitting alone in my car in that hospital parking lot. A lie about my own body had already cost me my marriage, and I had let it happen because I believed enduring it quietly was the decent thing to do. Now that same lie was reaching into the one place I had never let anyone touch before. My work, my name, the thing I had bled 10 years to build. And for the first time in my entire life, I understood that staying quiet wasn't patience anymore. It had a price tag, and someone else had been running up the bill without me ever noticing. A nurse I trusted, one who had watched me lose that promotion up close, gave me the name of an attorney named Eleanor Fields. Her office wasn't downtown or attached to some glass tower with a receptionist and a waiting room full of magazines. It was a converted house near the edge of town, with a wraparound porch and reading glasses that lived permanently pushed up into her gray hair, and a way of looking at you, like she was already 3 moves ahead of whatever you were about to say. I told her everything, sitting across from her desk in that quiet, sun-filled room. The marriage, the garden club whispers, the promotion that slipped away for reasons no one would say out loud. She listened without interrupting once, which I would come to learn was rare in her line of work, and when I finished, she set her pen down carefully and folded her hands. "What you're describing might be defamation," she said. "Maybe something close to it, but I won't sit here and tell you it's easy." She laid it out for me plainly, the way I lay out a diagnosis for a frightened patient. To win, we would have to prove 3 things: that a specific false statement had actually been made, that it had been spread beyond just a private conversation between 2 people, and that it had caused me real, measurable harm. "The harm part," she said, "you already have. A lost position is a number. A salary difference is a number. That's the easy part of this." I asked her about the rest, about proving the statement itself was false. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "That's the part you have to be willing to fight in public," she said. "They'll argue the statement was true. They'll argue you really were the reason. To win, you'd have to be prepared to prove that you weren't." My stomach dropped when she said it, because of course I couldn't prove that outright. My own results were normal, But a normal result only tells you it wasn't me. It doesn't tell a courtroom, or a town, whose fault the silence actually was. I remember sitting there seriously considering standing up and walking out, because the whole idea of it felt like inviting an entire community to dissect me all over again, this time with lawyers watching. Then Eleanor said the thing that finally settled it for me. "Silence isn't a virtue, Vivian," she said, "when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying." I didn't answer her right away. I spent nearly 2 weeks turning it over in my head, the way I read a chart, slowly at first and then all at once. I made a list of everything I stood to lose: the country club community that had known me since I moved to that coastline, my standing in a town that already half believed the worst about me, the whispers that would inevitably follow no matter what the truth turned out to be, calling me bitter, calling me the kind of woman who sues her ex-husband's family out of spite. I knew exactly how that story would sound, because they had already written most of it without me. Then I made another list. My name, my work, the plain, simple fact that I had done absolutely nothing wrong, and was still being punished as though I had. I kept circling back to one particular truth as I weighed it all. I wasn't doing this to hurt Colton. If hurting him had been the goal, I'd had an entire year of chances to do exactly that. I was doing this so that a hospital board somewhere would stop believing a story that was never true. So that the next time my name came up in a room I wasn't standing in, it would come up clean. That was the line I drew, and I drew it on purpose, with both eyes open. This wouldn't be revenge. Revenge is loud and hungry, and it never leaves you satisfied even when you get exactly what you asked for. This would simply be the truth, said once, in a place where it would finally count, by a woman who had decided she was done carrying a lie that had never belonged to her in the first place. I called Eleanor on a Monday morning before my shift and told her I was in. "Good," she said. "Then let's make them say it under oath." She drafted the complaint over the following weeks, naming the exact statements, the dates, the witnesses who had heard them said out loud. It laid out the lost position, the difference in salary, the documented damage to a professional reputation I had spent 10 years building brick by brick. Reading it for the first time felt strange, seeing my own quiet humiliation organized into numbered paragraphs, turned into something with actual weight and structure, instead of just something I carried silently in my chest every single day. When it was finally filed, the news moved through that town faster than any ambulance I had ever ridden in the back of. Vivian Cross is suing the Whitmores. Diane was, from what I heard, absolutely incandescent about it, telling anyone who would listen that grief over my empty house had turned me vengeful and cold. She doubled down on every single word she had ever said about me, which, though she had no way of knowing it yet, was exactly what Eleanor had been hoping she would do. Colton stayed quiet for weeks after the complaint was filed. So did Renee, but I started receiving messages from people around town, some cruel, some curious, and a few quietly supportive, from women who had watched their own reputations get rewritten by people who claimed to love them. I didn't respond to any of them. I just kept showing up to work and let the case move at the speed the law moves at, which is to say, painfully slow. Eleanor told me the next real turning point would be how Colton's side of this chose to respond. They had 2 roads available to them, she explained. They could claim the statements were simply opinion, hurt feelings dressed up as fact, nothing legally actionable. That road was annoying for us, but survivable for them. Or they could plant their flag and insist the statements had been true the entire time, that I really had been the reason. That road, she said, tapping her pen against the desk, is the one I am hoping to God they take. I asked her why. She smiled the way a woman smiles when she already knows exactly how a story is going to end. "Because then they have to prove it," she said, "and to prove it, they have to open a door." They took the second road, exactly like she predicted. Colton's lawyer filed a response, claiming the statements about me weren't defamation at all, because they were simply true. I really had been the reason our marriage never produced a child. The fault, they argued in writing, was medical, and it was mine. When Eleanor called to tell me, I could hear something close to delight underneath her usual steady tone. "They just handed us the magic words," she said. "Truth is a defense, but here's what they haven't thought through yet." She explained it carefully. To prove that statement true, to prove definitively that I was the infertile one, they would need to place both of our medical histories in front of a judge. She was careful not to oversell it to me, reminding me that reproductive records are about as protected as records get, and no court hands them over without a real fight. We would still have to convince a judge it was relevant and narrow enough to justify. But by swearing under oath that the cause was definitely me, Colton had accidentally handed us the exact reason we needed to finally ask about him. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I thought back through the entire timeline of our marriage, the way I would review an old chart searching for something I had missed the first time through. And there it was, 7 years earlier, buried in a memory I had filed away as nothing. A morning early in our marriage, when Colton drove up to the city alone for what he called a routine physical. He was gone the entire day. He came home different, quiet in a way that wasn't like him at all, short with me over nothing, and he poured himself a drink before dinner, which he never did on a weekday. When I asked if everything was all right, he told me the doctor up there was a quack, and the whole trip had been a waste of a day, and he changed the subject so fast it practically left a mark on the room. After that day, he never once brought up getting tested again. Before that trip, he had at least pretended to take the question seriously. After it, the subject simply closed, and somewhere in that very same stretch of weeks, the first whispers about me had quietly begun. I brought all of it to Eleanor the next morning. She listened without writing anything down, which by now I understood meant she was paying very close attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "On its own, that's nothing," she said gently. "A memory of a bad mood isn't evidence, but it is a reason to ask the right question." Because the other side had put my fertility directly at issue, and because they had sworn under oath the fault was definitely mine, Eleanor could now ask the court to compel the production of Colton's own relevant medical records. "If he wants to claim it was you," she said, "then the law lets us ask whether it was actually him. You cannot open a door halfway." The hearing on that motion got scheduled, and I had to sit with the not knowing for weeks, which for a woman, used to ordering a test and getting an immediate answer, felt like its own particular form of torture. Then, one evening while I was still turning all of it over in my head, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in nearly a year. Renee. No greeting, no explanation, just 4 words that stopped me cold, sitting alone in my kitchen. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." I read it 3 times over. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She had taken my husband and rebuilt an entire life in the wreckage of mine, and never once reached out. Not once, in all that time. And now, suddenly, she was begging me to stop a lawsuit that, on its face, had nothing whatsoever to do with her. If a quiet woman finally deciding to stop apologizing for her own life is the kind of story that speaks to you, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know, and hit subscribe now, because that single text from Renee was about to unravel a secret far bigger than anything I had gone looking for. That was the part that snagged in my mind and wouldn't let go. The lawsuit was between me and Colton and Diane. It was about statements said about my body, about a position I lost at the hospital. Renee's name never once appeared in a single page of that filing. So why would a woman holding the husband and the baby and the perfect new life be sending a midnight text begging her ex-best friend to stop digging? People who beg you to stop digging, I had learned over the past year, in more ways than one, usually already know exactly what's buried there. I didn't answer her. I just sat with the question, turning it slowly, feeling the shape of something I couldn't see yet, but could sense pressing against the edges of everything. The folder came back 8 days later. I need to be precise about how, because it matters to me that I did this the right way. I did not see the results first. I couldn't have, and I wouldn't have wanted to. I'm a surgeon, and there are records I have no right to touch. Not Colton's, not anyone's. That's the law, And it's a good one. The records went to Eleanor through the proper channel, under the protective order the judge had set in place, reviewed with Colton's own attorney present exactly the way it's supposed to happen. Then she called and asked me to come to her office in person, something she had never once done before in the entire course of the case. I knew before I even sat down in that chair on her porch. 7 years ago, she told me quietly, Colton went to a clinic in the city, the same one I remembered from that strange, silent evening. She slid a single sheet across the desk toward me, only the line that mattered visible, everything else blacked out beneath the court seal. The diagnosis was a term I had written on charts more times than I could count, a condition meaning no measurable sperm, medically making it essentially impossible for him to father a biological child on his own. 7 years ago, in plain clinical language, the same week he had come home from that trip cold and short and closed off, the same stretch of weeks the very first whispers about me had begun making their way through the garden club. I sat there completely still. Eleanor watched me the careful way you watch a patient, right after you've delivered scan results that change everything. I didn't cry and I didn't shout. I felt something enormous and quiet rearrange itself, somewhere deep inside my chest, like a bone finally settling back into the joint it had been dislocated from for years. For 6 years I had been the broken one, the reason whispered about at every dinner table in that town, and the man who let an entire community believe that he had known the whole time that the emptiness in our house had never once belonged to me. I drove home with that single sheet of paper folded carefully in my bag, and I didn't turn the radio on once. I had braced myself for triumph, had almost worried about becoming a person who felt joy at someone else's ruin, but triumph never actually arrived. What came instead was something stranger, something closer to grief. 6 years of my life spent absorbing a wound that was never mine to carry. Every pitying glance across a gala floor, every version of some women just aren't built for it, every sleepless night wondering what exactly I had failed to give a marriage that had never had a chance to begin with. All of it had been a story Colton wrote to protect himself from a truth he couldn't face, and his own mother had pinned that story onto me with both hands, believing every word of it. And that was when the second question rose in me, one I couldn't push back down once it had formed. If Colton had received that diagnosis 7 years ago, if the clinic's findings still held, then the healthy baby boy Diane had bragged about in that hospital hallway, the son Colton was proudly parading through the maternity wing as living proof of everything I supposedly couldn't give him, could not possibly be his. A man with that particular diagnosis rarely fathers a child naturally, not without treatment Colton had never once sought in all those years. Which left only one real possibility. Either the clinic had made a catastrophic error, which happens but rarely, or the child everyone in that town believed belonged to Colton Whitmore had actually been fathered by someone else entirely. And suddenly, Renee's midnight text made a horrible, perfect kind of sense. I want to be very clear about what I did next, because it matters deeply to me that I handled it the right way. I never went looking into that baby's records. I had no right to, and I never would have. That child was innocent in every version of this story, and I have never once wished him anything but a good, steady life. What I had was simply a contradiction, one the Whitmores themselves had built with their own hands by swearing under oath the fault was mine. I called Eleanor and told her I believed there was more buried underneath all of this. She didn't even pause. Then let the court find it, she said, not us. It turned out that during the very months Renee had been quietly getting closer to Colton behind my back, she had also been involved with another man, a quiet, steady man named Marcus Delano, who had believed their relationship meant far more than it apparently had to her. When Renee chose Colton, she cut Marcus off completely, blocked his number, never once told him she was expecting, never breathed a single word about a due date. She had gambled that he would simply fade away and never connect the dots. But the timing hadn't sat right with him, and he had spent months quietly asking questions of the few people they had both known, until, that very morning, someone finally let the hospital and the date slip out. so he came to see the child he had already begun to suspect was his own. Colton knew. That is the piece of this I keep coming back to, the piece that turns everything from sad into something I still struggle to forgive. He had known for 7 full years that fathering a child on his own was medically impossible for him. So when Renee's pregnancy test came back positive, he knew, with absolute certainty, that the baby growing inside her could not possibly be his. And he took it anyway. He stood in front of his mother, his community, his entire small world, and let every single one of them believe he had finally made a son. The son his supposedly barren first wife had failed to give him. He used a child who wasn't his to complete the exact story that had spent 6 years quietly destroying my life. I tried, honestly, to find some corner of sympathy for him somewhere in all of this. I am not naturally a hard woman, but every single time I reached for it, I hit the same wall. He had 100 quiet chances to simply tell the truth and let me go gently. Instead, he built an entire monument to a lie and placed a real, innocent child on top of it. When Eleanor told me Colton's attorney had gone completely silent, no more motions, no more fight, just a quiet request to discuss resolving the matter privately, I understood exactly why. He wasn't afraid of losing the lawsuit anymore. He was afraid of what that lawsuit would say out loud, in a room full of witnesses, about the son he had been showing off for weeks. Diane came to see me before the hearing, standing on my porch in her good church clothes, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her look before. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because for one brief moment I genuinely thought she might. She simply asked me, her voice cracking down the middle, to drop the entire thing. Not for Colton's sake, she said, but for the family, for the baby, for the name. And standing there in my own doorway, I saw something in her I hadn't expected to see. A woman who had been lied to by her own son for 7 years, who had built her entire identity around the certainty that he was good, because if he wasn't, then what exactly had all her sacrifice bought her? For one breath, I actually felt for her, but then she said it one more time, the same line she had repeated for years, only now it came out as a plea instead of a verdict. Some women just aren't built for it, Vivian, she said quietly. Why drag everyone through the mud over it? And I understood, even standing right there on the edge of the truth, that she would still rather protect the lie than finally let it go. Sympathy is not surrender. Go home, I told her gently. The mud was never mine to begin with. She left without another word, and I closed the door feeling not cruel, but finished. The hearing took place on a bright, cold morning at the county courthouse. Eleanor never once raised her voice. She built the case the way you build a diagnosis, one careful finding at a time, until the conclusion was the only thing left standing in the room. She read the statements into the record, the dates, the witnesses, Diane's own words repeated back exactly as she had spoken them at gala after gala. Then she addressed the defense's own sworn claim that the fault had been mine, and asked the court to consider the medical record the Whitmores themselves had forced into the case. Under the protective order, only the necessary line was read aloud. 7 years earlier, Colton Whitmore had been diagnosed with a condition making it medically impossible for him to father a biological child. The temperature of that entire room changed in an instant, and then, gently, without a hint of drama in her voice, Eleanor noted that the paternity of the child in question had already become relevant in a related family court matter, and that genetic testing there had not supported Colton as the biological father. Colton shot up out of his chair, his voice cracking across the courtroom before the judge told him firmly to sit. Diane rose right along with him, saying my name like an accusation, insisting I had twisted everything, until finally, out of the wreckage of her own composure, the only words left in her came tumbling out one final time. Some women just aren't built for it, she cried, pointing a shaking finger across the room. Some women just aren't. She couldn't even finish the sentence a second time. I stood up slowly, because I had waited 7 years for this exact moment, and I wasn't going to rush a single second of it. You're right, Diane, I said, my voice calm and flat and clear. One person in this marriage was truly never built to have children. I let the silence hold for a moment before I finished it. The file only ever had his name on it. Colton left the state within a few months, and the town that had once believed every word Diane whispered slowly stopped believing anything she said at all. The hospital board reinstated me as chief of trauma without much ceremony, though the chairman came about as close to an apology as men like him ever manage. Renee and Marcus worked through the matter of paternity the proper way, through the courts, and I truly hope, for that child's sake, they found something steady on the other side of it. I never spoke to Renee again. Some friendships, I learned, don't actually break. They simply turn out never to have been what you thought they were, and you set them down along with everything else you no longer have to carry. I wrote Diane one short note after it was all finally over. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, it said, and neither should you. I never expected a reply, and I never got one, but writing it closed something inside me I had been holding shut for years. If you take one thing from everything I've told you tonight, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout, and it doesn't chase anyone down. It simply waits, patient as a held breath, for the moment someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. If you've ever been told you were the broken one, let this be your sign to finally set that story down. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment below and subscribe, because there is always another quiet woman out there, just about to find her voice.